Well, you referred to it a while ago as Irwin's Chapel. We call it Irwin's Chapel Church, just to make sure we get all of that out, even though it be a bit redundant. Of course, if you have a settlement in this part of the country, or in any part of the country, I suppose, one of the central aspects and buildings of the community would be and was the church. This one came from right on the Tennessee line in North Carolina, Madison County, one of the most mountainous counties in the whole area, I guess. And I had heard about a friend of mine, I believe David Bird, told me about this old fellow that had bought and moved into his place there just out of Asheville, a little place called Woodfin. And he had moved this church in. He was a preacher, maybe a part-time preacher, and he had in mind starting a little church museum, and he'd moved this little church in from a place called Hamburg, North Carolina. I've never been able to find it on the map, so it must have been pretty small. And he presumably, according to what had been passed down, had paid after the church had folded, and bigger churches had been built in the community, and this was sitting vacant out in the mountains somewhere, and most of the people had moved off, so there was no congregation anymore. So he bought it, I assume, from the original property owners. Most of the time, in many cases at any rate, the church was built on someone's property. They just let them build it and gave it to the church sometime as long as it was used for a church. At any rate, the old preacher there in Asheville, Tweed was his name, bought it for $35 and a cowboy hat. You can imagine what the type of person that he bought it from, because he wanted that cowboy hat on the deal. So he moved it into his place there in Woodfin, a little community just north of Asheville, and had when I found it, he had not only had the benches and the pulpit, he also had a lot of other memorabilia. So I bought the church and everything that was in it. These benches were there, and so was the log pulpit, and well, actually everything, and even the chair back here was part of it. I'm not sure whether these benches, I guess if I were totally honest, I would say that they probably were not in the first original, back to redundancy again, church, but they could have been. They're old enough. The logs are very old and hand-hewn and 150 years old, but he had, by the time that I got in touch with the Tweed family, the old gentleman had passed on, and I bought this from his wife. So that's sort of the story of the short version of the Irwin's Chapel Church. I would point out that I didn't necessarily name it after myself, because my grandfather was a Methodist preacher, and he preached part-time in a church called Irwin's Chapel. So I can get away with it and not appear to be too egotistical by naming a church after myself. I can have the excuse that I named it after my grandfather. I have not seen that log, a hollow log like that, used as a pulpit, but the puncheons would have been original, because in that era, the hand-hewn flooring, which they hewed with a broad axe, was the type that probably would have been used. this is pretty much of a favorite spot for a lot of people who come here, especially when we have some of the older folks singing. We had an old gentleman who sang what he called the do-re-mi style, and without any do, 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 re, 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 and it was just really impressive. During homecoming, he was here every year until he passed on a few years ago, and he really fell in love with this. Hedrick was his name, Louis Hedrick, and Louis would bring a group down during the 4 days of homecoming, and sometimes we had 45 or 50,000 people during the 4 days. And I've received many letters saying that this was the most inspiring and memorable part of the entire trip here at the museum, because they would be singing, and the church was almost always filled, and it was sort of a come and go. When people stayed for a few minutes or several minutes, they would leave, and then others would be waiting to come in, and if it were filled, which it was most of the time, people would stand at the windows and the doors and listen, and it had maybe even more inspirational effect, just exuding from the church. But Louis, I think, enjoyed the singing as much as the congregation enjoyed listening to it, and he was quite ill for some time, and didn't have long to live, his son said. And one day, one of his sons called me and said, Pap wants to come down to the church. Said he's in bad condition, he's not going to live long, and he's on morphine. But one last request that he had was to come down and see the old church again. So his son brought him down, and we had to help him walk over here. He was so feeble. But he came over here and sat down and talked a little while, and told his son he had to go, and he passed on just 3 or 4 or 5 days after that. But it was a great inspiration to him and the singers that he brought. So we have singing here during homecoming still by other people, some of his folks, as a matter of fact. And also we have during the 4th of July celebration and several other events, special events. My daughter, Elaine, who does some peculiar things sometimes, she decided she wanted to get married in this church. And that wasn't so bad, but she wanted to get married just at daybreak. And so it was all set up and raining, wind blowing like it is now. And she had on this wedding dress, back in the mud and all, and 2 people had to follow along behind. And so she was married here, and